You lie in bed with your eyes closed, waiting for sleep that refuses to come. Your body is exhausted. Your schedule demanded more than you had to give today. Every logical calculation confirms that you should be unconscious within minutes of your head touching the pillow. Yet here you are, awake, your mind cycling through thoughts that seem to intensify rather than fade as the minutes pass. You shift positions, you adjust your pillow, you tell yourself to relax. Nothing works. The clock advances toward midnight, then past it, while sleep remains just out of reach. When you finally drift off, the sleep that comes is shallow and fragmented. You wake multiple times without knowing why. Dreams are vivid and unsettling when they come at all. The morning alarm finds you feeling as though you barely slept, despite spending 7 or 8 hours in bed. You drag yourself through another day with caffeine and willpower, only to repeat the same frustrating cycle when night falls again. What you may not realize is that your struggle has a specific physiological cause that begins hours before you attempt to sleep. The hormone governing your wakefulness, the chemical signal that tells your brain whether to remain vigilant or surrender to rest, has been elevated when it should have been declining. Cortisol, the compound most people associate with stress, has remained high into the evening hours, sending your brain a message that contradicts your intention to sleep. Stay alert, remain watchful, do not let your guard down. Understanding cortisol reframes everything about your sleep difficulties. This is not about willpower or trying harder to relax. This is about biology responding to signals you may be sending without realizing it. Your nervous system is not malfunctioning. It is doing exactly what evolution designed it to do, keeping you awake when it perceives that circumstances require vigilance. The problem is that modern life sends vigilance signals during hours when ancient humans would have been safely asleep in darkness, their cortisol naturally low, their bodies restored by sleep that came easily because nothing opposed it. The encouraging news is that cortisol responds to signals you can control. The same nervous system that elevates cortisol in response to perceived threats can be guided toward calm in response to perceived safety. The question is not whether your cortisol can drop, because it certainly can. The question is whether you are providing the cues that allow it to drop, or whether you are inadvertently providing cues that keep it elevated. Tonight, I want to teach you 3 habits that directly address the signals your nervous system uses to determine cortisol levels. These are not complicated protocols or elaborate rituals. They are simple practices that work because they align with how your biology actually operates. They require minutes, not hours, they cost nothing, and they produce effects that can transform your sleep from the very first night you implement them fully. Before I describe the habits, let me explain why what happens before bed matters more than most people realize. The quality of your sleep is not determined by what you do in the morning, or even during the day, though those factors contribute. The quality of your sleep is determined primarily by what happens in the hour before you attempt to sleep. This final hour either prepares your nervous system to release into rest, or charges it with vigilance that will persist through the night. Most people pay little attention to this critical hour. They remain engaged with screens, work, stressful conversations, or stimulating content right up until they close their eyes. Then they expect their biology to instantly shift from full engagement to complete release. This is not how the nervous system works. The transition from waking to sleeping is not a switch that flips, but a gradual process that requires time and appropriate conditions. Denying this reality does not change it. It only ensures that sleep will be compromised. Cortisol's role in this process is central but often misunderstood. People think of cortisol as the stress hormone, which is accurate but incomplete. Cortisol is fundamentally an alertness hormone, a chemical signal that tells your brain to remain vigilant, to maintain awareness of your environment, to be ready to respond to whatever challenges might appear. This alertness is valuable when challenges actually exist. It is problematic when it persists into hours meant for recovery. In a healthy pattern, cortisol rises sharply upon waking, providing the energy and alertness to meet the day. It remains moderate through daytime hours, supporting activity and engagement. It begins declining in the afternoon, signaling the transition toward evening. By nighttime, it should reach its lowest levels, allowing the sleep-promoting processes that depend on cortisol's absence to proceed. When this pattern is disrupted, when cortisol remains elevated into evening, sleep becomes difficult or impossible, not because anything is wrong with your sleep mechanisms, but because cortisol is actively opposing them. Your brain receives the hormonal message that alertness is required. It responds accordingly, maintaining vigilance that prevents the deep, restorative sleep your body needs. Your brain constantly monitors both external and internal cues to decide whether alertness is warranted. Is the environment safe? Is the body under threat? Are there unresolved problems requiring attention? The answers to these questions, as your brain interprets them, determine whether cortisol remains elevated or is allowed to fall. If the brain perceives danger, uncertainty, or incompleteness, cortisol stays high. If the brain perceives safety, resolution, and completion, cortisol can decline. This is where the 3 habits become powerful. Each habit addresses a different category of cues that your brain uses to assess whether sleep is appropriate. Together, they create conditions where cortisol has no reason to remain elevated, where the nervous system receives clear signals that the time for vigilance has passed, where sleep becomes not something you force, but something that arrives naturally because nothing opposes it. The first habit involves light, the most powerful environmental signal your brain uses to determine what time it is and what state it should be in. Your brain contains a master clock that coordinates biological rhythms throughout your body. This clock, located in the hypothalamus, does not operate independently. It synchronizes to the external world primarily through light detected by specialized receptors in your eyes. These receptors are particularly sensitive to blue wavelengths, the kind of light that dominates the daytime sky and that emanates from every screen you use. When your eyes detect bright light, particularly blue-enriched light, your brain receives the signal that daytime continues. The suppression of melatonin, the hormone that prepares you for sleep, continues. The elevation of cortisol, which should be declining, is maintained or even increased. Your entire physiology remains in daytime mode despite the clock on your wall indicating otherwise. This is why screen use before bed is so damaging to sleep, and why simply using screens in bed is not the only problem. The light reaching your eyes in the hours before bed shapes the hormonal environment in which you will attempt to sleep. Bright artificial lighting throughout your home, the glow of screens even when not held close to your face, the environmental light that seems normal because you have lived with it your entire adult life, all of this sends signals that contradict your intention to sleep. The habit is straightforward. Dim your environment substantially during the final hour before bed. This does not require sitting in darkness or using candles, though those would work. It requires reducing light levels to something that approximates evening rather than midday. It means turning off overhead lights and using lamps with warm, low-wattage bulbs. It means reducing screen brightness dramatically, or, better, eliminating screens entirely. It means creating an environment where your brain can actually perceive that night has arrived. The effect of this light reduction begins immediately. Within minutes of reducing light exposure, your brain begins adjusting its assessment of what time it is. Melatonin production, which has been suppressed by bright light, begins rising. Cortisol, which has been maintained by alertness signals, begins falling. The hormonal environment shifts toward one that supports, rather than opposes sleep. Many people resist this habit because it feels inconvenient. They have tasks to complete, shows to watch, messages to answer. But these activities can often be done earlier, or can wait until tomorrow. What cannot wait is the biological preparation that sleep requires. Attempting to sleep with elevated cortisol and suppressed melatonin is fighting against your own physiology. The struggle you experience is not weakness. It is the predictable consequence of biological systems operating exactly as designed in response to the signals you provide. The shift from bright to dim lighting sends a message to your nervous system that the vigilance required during daylight is no longer needed. The threats that might appear in bright light are not present in dim evening. The activities that require full alertness are appropriate for daytime, not for the approaching night. By dimming your environment, you communicate to your brain that the day has ended, that safety has arrived, that the elaborate machinery of sleep can now engage. Some people find that warm-toned lights make this transition easier. The amber and orange tones of firelight, the illumination that humans experienced at night for thousands of years, lacks the blue wavelengths that most strongly suppress melatonin. Replacing cool white bulbs with warm alternatives, using amber-tinted glasses if screens must be viewed, or simply using candlelight for the final hour creates an environment that your biology recognizes as appropriate for evening. The timing matters as much as the intensity. Beginning this slight reduction an hour before your intended sleep time gives your hormonal systems adequate opportunity to shift. Trying to cram the transition into the final minutes before bed does not provide enough time for the biological changes to occur. Start dimming when you have an hour remaining, let the transition proceed gradually, and arrive at bedtime with hormones already configured for sleep rather than fighting against you. The second habit addresses the mental dimension of cortisol elevation, the rumination and unresolved thoughts that keep your brain in problem-solving mode when it should be releasing into rest. Your brain is essentially a threat detection and problem-solving organ. It evolved to identify dangers, plan responses, and work through challenges until they are resolved. This is valuable during waking hours when action is possible. It becomes problematic at night when the problems your brain churns on cannot be addressed until morning anyway. The mental activity accomplishes nothing practical while generating cortisol that prevents the sleep you need. When you lie down with unresolved tasks, unprocessed worries, and incomplete plans, your brain interprets these as open loops requiring attention. It maintains alertness because, from its perspective, problems remain that might need immediate response. The to-do list you did not write down, the conversation you need to have tomorrow, the decision you have been avoiding, all of these create a background hum of mental activity that keeps cortisol elevated even when you consciously want to sleep. The habit that addresses this involves deliberately closing mental loops before attempting to sleep. This is often called brain dumping or offloading, and it works because it changes your brain's assessment of what requires ongoing attention. Take a few minutes before bed to write down anything that is occupying mental space. This does not need to be elaborate journaling or detailed planning. It can be a simple list scrawled on a piece of paper. The goal is to externalize the thoughts that are circulating internally, to put them somewhere your brain knows they will not be forgotten, to signal that these matters have been captured and do not require ongoing mental maintenance. The act of writing produces a psychological effect that mental acknowledgement alone does not achieve. When you keep thoughts in your head, your brain must maintain them actively, holding them in working memory, returning to them periodically to ensure they are not lost. When you write them down, you transfer the maintenance function to the paper. Your brain can release the thoughts because they are now stored externally. The loop closes, not because the problems are solved, but because they are secured for future attention. Include in this offloading anything that is generating concern, however trivial it may seem. The email you forgot to send, the appointment you need to schedule, the worry about a family member, the decision you are facing at work. None of these require immediate action at 11 at night. All of them generate mental activity that elevates cortisol if they remain unaddressed in your mind. Some people find it helpful to add a brief note about when they will address each item. This provides additional closure by assigning the task to a specific future time. Your brain does not need to maintain vigilance about something that has been scheduled for attention tomorrow at 10. It can release the matter because it knows when it will be handled. Others benefit from writing a sentence or two about how the day went, what they are grateful for or what they hope for tomorrow. This is not about positivity for its own sake. It is about providing a sense of completeness to the day, a sense that the day's experience has been processed and can now be released. The writing creates a transition between the active engagement of daytime and the surrender of sleep. The physical act of putting pen to paper may matter more than using digital notes, though either works. The tactile experience of writing engages your brain differently than typing. It slows the process, requiring more presence and attention. This slowness is valuable when the goal is to create a transition rather than efficiently capture information. After completing this mental offloading, you may notice that your mind feels quieter. The thoughts that were circulating demanding attention have been addressed. They exist on paper now, secured and scheduled. Your brain can stand down from the maintenance function it was performing. The cortisol that was supporting that mental activity has less reason to remain elevated. This habit requires only a few minutes, but can transform the mental landscape you bring to bed. Instead of arriving with dozens of open loops demanding attention, you arrive with matters handled temporarily but sufficiently, allowing sleep to proceed without competition from problem-solving systems that cannot actually solve anything until morning. The third habit addresses the physical dimension of cortisol elevation through techniques that directly shift your nervous system from sympathetic dominance to parasympathetic dominance, from the arousal state that maintains alertness to the calm state that permits sleep. Your autonomic nervous system operates in two modes that function somewhat like a seesaw. The sympathetic branch activates during stress, danger, and engagement, elevating heart rate, tensing muscles, sharpening attention. The parasympathetic branch activates during rest, digestion, and recovery, slowing heart rate, relaxing muscles, allowing restoration. These branches constantly balance each other, with circumstances determining which dominates at any given time. When you're stressed, anxious, or even just engaged with stimulating content, sympathetic activation increases. Your body prepares for action. Cortisol rises to support this preparation. This is appropriate during the day when action may be needed. It becomes problematic at night when the only action required is sleep, which sympathetic activation prevents. The remarkable feature of this system is that it responds to physical signals as well as mental ones. Your brain assesses whether stress is present partly based on what your body is doing. If your body is tense, your brain concludes that tension is warranted. If your breathing is rapid and shallow, your brain concludes that alertness is needed. If your muscles are tight, your brain maintains the sympathetic activation that would naturally accompany that tension. This creates the possibility of shifting nervous system state through physical means. By deliberately relaxing your body and adjusting your breathing, you send signals to your brain that the stress requiring vigilance has passed. Your brain responds by allowing sympathetic activation to diminish and parasympathetic dominance to increase. Cortisol falls because the physical signals no longer support its elevation. Controlled breathing is the most accessible tool for producing this shift. Your breath is unusual among autonomic functions because it operates automatically, but can also be voluntarily controlled. This gives you a direct lever into the autonomic nervous system that other functions do not provide. The key pattern involves extending your exhalations relative to your inhalations. When you inhale, sympathetic activation increases slightly. When you exhale, parasympathetic activation increases slightly. This is why sighs feel relieving. The long exhalation shifts nervous system balance toward calm. By deliberately making your exhalations longer than your inhalations, you repeatedly shift the balance toward parasympathetic dominance. A simple approach involves inhaling for a count of 4 and exhaling for a count of 6 or 8. The specific numbers matter less than the pattern of extended exhalation. Repeat this breathing for several minutes, allowing each cycle to slightly increase parasympathetic activation until your overall state has shifted. As you breathe this way, notice your body relaxing. Shoulders that were tight begin dropping. The jaw that was clenched softens. The belly that was held releases. These changes are not imagined. They are the physical consequences of nervous system shift that the breathing pattern produces. Your body moves from the configuration of stress to the configuration of rest, and your brain registers this shift as evidence that safety has arrived. Some people benefit from deliberately tensing and then releasing muscle groups, a practice sometimes called progressive relaxation. By systematically tensing the feet, then releasing, then the calves, then releasing, moving progressively through the body, you create pronounced relaxation that the nervous system cannot ignore. The contrast between tension and release makes the relaxation state more noticeable and more complete. Others find that simple body scans, where attention moves slowly through the body, noticing and releasing any tension found, produce similar effects. The attention itself, without deliberate tensing, is often sufficient to allow holding to release. What matters is that attention is directed inward, to physical sensation, rather than outward to thoughts or stimulation. The physical relaxation that these practices produce sends a powerful signal to your brain. A relaxed body is a body that perceives safety. A body that perceives safety has no reason to maintain elevated cortisol. The hormone that was keeping you alert, that was preventing the sleep you wanted, begins declining because the physical evidence no longer supports its elevation. The combination of these three habits creates conditions where cortisol has no reason to remain elevated. The light environment signals nighttime, the mental environment signals completion, the physical environment signals safety. Each category of cue that your brain uses to determine whether vigilance is required has been addressed. Sleep becomes not something you must force, but something that arrives naturally when nothing opposes it. The biological nature of sleep deserves emphasis, because it changes how you approach the transition from waking to rest. Sleep is not a voluntary state you can simply decide to enter. It is a biological process that occurs when conditions permit, conditions that involve hormonal configuration, nervous system state, and perceived safety. You cannot force sleep any more than you can force digestion or heartbeat. You can only create conditions that allow it to occur. This is why trying harder to sleep is counterproductive. The effort itself generates the activation that prevents what you are trying to achieve. The frustration of failed sleep produces cortisol. The worry about not sleeping produces more cortisol. The vigilant monitoring of whether you're falling asleep produces still more cortisol. You create a self-defeating cycle where the attempt to sleep becomes the obstacle to sleeping. The 3 habits work precisely because they do not involve trying to sleep. They involve creating conditions where sleep becomes inevitable. You dim the lights not to force sleep but to allow melatonin and reduce cortisol. You offload your thoughts not to force sleep but to close mental loops and reduce vigilance. You relax your body not to force sleep but to shift nervous system balance and signal safety. Sleep follows as the natural consequence of these preparations, not as something you willed into existence. Consistency in applying these habits produces effects that extend beyond any single night. Your nervous system learns from repeated experience. When you provide the same signals night after night, your biology begins anticipating them. The cortisol decline that required deliberate intervention at first begins happening automatically. The sleep that seemed elusive becomes reliable. Your relationship with nighttime transforms from adversarial to cooperative. This training effect explains why occasional good nights do not produce lasting improvement while consistent habits do. Your nervous system needs repetition to update its expectations. A single night of good practices followed by a week of poor practices does not teach your nervous system anything lasting. A week of consistent practice begins establishing patterns that persist. A month of consistent practice creates habits that become automatic. Many people find that these habits transform not just their sleep, but their evening experience generally. The hour before bed becomes calmer, more pleasant, less frantic. The transition from day to night becomes a genuine unwinding rather than an abrupt halt. The sense of being perpetually behind, never quite finished, never able to rest because something always remains undone, begins softening as the practice of deliberate closure and release becomes established. The morning after a night of good sleep produced by these habits feels different from the morning after a night of fragmented rest. Energy is present without needing to be manufactured through caffeine. Mental clarity is available without struggling to achieve it. The day ahead seems manageable rather than threatening. This morning experience reinforces the value of the nighttime practices, creating positive feedback that makes the habits easier to maintain. Some people experience dramatic improvement from the first night they implement these habits fully. Their cortisol was so elevated, and the removal of stimulating inputs so immediate that the contrast is stark. Others experience gradual improvement over days or weeks as their nervous system recalibrates expectations and learns to trust the signals of safety they are providing. Either pattern represents success. The body is responding to change conditions in the way bodies respond, sometimes dramatically, sometimes gradually, but always in the direction of health when conditions support it. The obstacles to implementing these habits are usually not practical but psychological. People resist dimming lights because bright environments feel normal, and dim environments feel strange. They resist the mental offloading because it feels like making more work for themselves. They resist physical relaxation practices because lying still with attention inward feels uncomfortable or boring. These resistances are themselves interesting data, suggesting how accustomed to stimulation and activity modern minds have become. Pushing through these resistances for even a few nights often reveals that what felt strange becomes comfortable. What felt like extra work produces its own satisfaction. What felt boring becomes peaceful. The discomfort was not inherent in the practices but in their unfamiliarity. As familiarity develops, the practices become not only tolerable, but welcomed, a part of the evening that you anticipate with pleasure rather than endure with effort. The relationship between cortisol and sleep is bidirectional in ways that make these habits even more valuable. High cortisol prevents good sleep, but poor sleep also elevates cortisol. The cycle feeds itself, each bad night making the next night worse. By intervening at the cortisol end through these evening habits, you break the cycle. Good sleep allows cortisol to normalize. Normalized cortisol allows better sleep. The cycle begins operating in reverse, each good night supporting the next. After weeks of consistent practice, many people find that their baseline stress levels have diminished, not just at night but throughout the day. The nervous system that has learned to release into rest at night carries some of that capacity into daytime. The resilience that comes from genuine restoration improves coping with challenges. The mental clarity that comes from consolidated sleep improves problem solving. The benefits extend far beyond the nighttime hours where the practices are applied. What you do in the final hour before sleep shapes not just that night's rest, but your health, your mood, your cognitive function, your relationships, and your capacity to engage with whatever challenges your life presents. Sleep is not a luxury or an indulgence. It is a biological necessity that affects every system in your body and every function of your mind. Prioritizing the conditions that allow good sleep is not self-indulgence. It is intelligent management of the single intervention that most affects everything else. Tonight, as evening approaches, you have an opportunity to do something different. Instead of maintaining full illumination until the moment you attempt to sleep, begin dimming an hour before bed. Instead of carrying open mental loops into the darkness, write them down and put them aside. Instead of arriving in bed with a tense body and racing thoughts, spend a few minutes breathing slowly and allowing physical release. These habits ask little of you in terms of time or effort. They ask only that you prioritize the conditions your biology requires over the habits modern life has established. They ask that you treat sleep not as something that should happen automatically, but as something that requires preparation, that deserves respect, that will respond to the care you provide. Your cortisol will respond. It has no choice but to respond. It is a hormone that follows signals, and the signals you provide will change. As cortisol falls, as melatonin rises, as your nervous system perceives the safety you have created, sleep will come not because you forced it, but because nothing remained to prevent it. The struggle you have experienced with sleep is not evidence of something broken within you. It is evidence of signals misaligned with intentions, of biology responding accurately to conditions that contradicted what you actually wanted. Change the conditions and the biology follows. Provide the signals your nervous system needs, and it will respond. 3 habits. 1 hour before bed. Dimmed lights, cleared mind, relaxed body. This is how you lower cortisol fast. This is how you reclaim the sleep that has been eluding you. This is how you wake tomorrow, feeling something you may have forgotten was possible, genuinely rested.